Yeah, I found it. I found it. So Derek, just to give you a heads up, we are recording this webinar so that it can be reviewed by whom was it? Jack?
Aquila.
Aquila.
Okay.
If you want to have a more sensible discussion towards the end, we can stop the recording and then engage in that discussion. Okay, we still had 4 other participants lined up, which apparently won't make it or might be delayed. So let's start with that.
Okay.
We look at a number of points through this webinar on how to complete a first draft thesis proposal, the subsequent conversion process from research proposal into the first thesis draft. And we'll look at the critical elements to be covered within the thesis proposal, and also how to assure that it would be actionable and front-ward compatible. So this is very important. Both are very important elements. Now, ideally, the way from A to B would be a very smooth one, but as we just discussed it already, time is one of the critical elements that might not allow for such. Having said that, if the proposal is providing a clear and realistic outline of what is to be done, then it also will provide a very good guidance and allows us to establish boundaries very quickly, and thereby easing our way through the research. What is, I think, important is to understand what I'm now presenting in the following slides are some example guidances that I found at the internet and which I thought provide some good support. Therefore, I put the sources in for all of those guidances to be reviewed subsequently. So in this guidance, one example, what I found interesting, that it's a research proposal can be considered a roadmap. And this is very much it. And the reason being is that the thesis proposal is a mirror of the knowledge that you hold at the starting point of your research about the wider issue, the more detailed research problem, about related studies that you have come across in your initial readings. So it's all initial and nothing really in depth. Therefore, it cannot be expected that, unlike, for example, if we compare a thesis research proposal with a project proposal from the business world, then these two are very different because project proposal is meant to be followed. There are fixed deadlines and usually also agreed penalties. What happens if deadlines are not met, and so forth. So it's rather working alongside execution of a proposal instead of innovating and inventing as we go along. And innovating and development as we go along is inherent to the research process, and thereby all assumptions that we put forward at the starting point are exactly just that, assumptions. And it cannot be expected that the research afterwards will be carried out as such, nor that we already know at the starting point where we will end up at the end point of the thesis. So this is important to be taken into consideration. Then, if we compare the thesis proposal with the subsequent thesis drafts, they will cover roughly the same elements. There will be a title, which is tentative. There will be a statement of the problem, background and history, justification of the problem, the literature review, the methodology, and what is different in the thesis proposal to the subsequent thesis is that in the proposal you will have a research schedule, while later on in the thesis you will work not on a schedule that's included in the thesis, but rather alongside your own roadmap that you keep maintained. And I've been coming across a number of sources, and the guidances that were provided are roughly all pointing to the same things, that a thesis proposal should include, and that subsequently, as a matter of fact, directly translate to the first 3 chapters of your thesis. The statement, background, and justification of the problem are commonly presented in the chapter 1 introduction, while the literature review in the classical thesis typically is in chapter 2, and DBA thesis, like perhaps the case for the University of Liverpool, this order is flipped. But either in chapter 2 or chapter 3, the literature and the methodology are covered. So all of that is covered already in the thesis proposal, and as more precisely as we are and as more frontward oriented the proposal is drafted, as easier it will be later to start the execution of the research process. Now, some of the sources provided even a more detailed view of what the thesis proposal shall be covering, like here in the 3rd point, a statement on the overall design, explanatory interest, theoretical framing, model or hypothesis to be tested. If we talk about quantitative studies, that might be the case, or rather the more broad research questions to be answered if we talk about qualitative studies. Like also the conceptual and operational properties of the variables as we understand them by today, based upon our own experience or based upon a review of the literature. And of course, an interpretation of the problem based upon the knowledge as we hold it at current. So those are things that make up the thesis proposal. Now, where I've been quite pleased with was that I found some suggestions I would have been providing to students also in guides to be found, like this one, because it makes clear that not only the 3 first chapters can be directly extracted based upon the thesis proposal, but it also talks about the conversion process, how you can take further the content from your thesis proposal into your first thesis draft. So this is what I would like to do with replacing this is what I did, as for example, in this guide outlined. So it's the way you write things already in your thesis proposal makes a difference. If you write it frontward compatible, it's easy to afterwards turn a proposal into the first draft of your thesis, thereby not needing to start from scratch, but to have already a solid base that you will be working over again. Because this is also a uniqueness of the thesis writing process, as much as of the thesis proposal drafting, it's always outdated. That means the minute you put down the pencil and stop writing on something, it's outdated. The reason being is that you continue thinking, you continue analyzing, you will form different opinions that you had before, and you will continue reading literature or talking to others, thereby shaping the way you think about your thesis, and meaning the version that you just finished is already outdated, so the next version you will be working on. So it's important to understand that it is a dynamic undertaking, and that the thesis, as well as the initial proposal, as well as the subsequent thesis drafts, will always be lacking being up to date. And if you understand that, then this can help you very much in the process. And let me continue to the next slide. So this also means then that is from CSIS proposal towards a CSIS draft, it is a one-time of reuse situation from whereby you flip from what you will be doing, boys, towards what you are going to do or are doing or have been doing. And afterwards, it's very much outdated and obsolete, the CSIS proposal. So the minute you will have the ethics clearance, that's the minute where latest the CSIS proposal is obsolete, and you will start working rather over your CSIS draft and just keep the initial proposal for guidance and checking back to see how you have been progressing. Am I too quick, or are the two of you still with me? Jack, Derek?
So far it's good. Thank you.
So far it's good. Okay.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you.
Good. So, and I think what is also important is to understand with this, it's a negotiated document. I find this that expression very useful, because it shows that there is no such thing as right or wrong, but rather it's an ongoing negotiation that the thesis author has with oneself, but also with the supervisor and with other peoples who are engaged. So it's not like one can, that the doctoral student can rely on the feedback that the supervisor is giving with regards to whether or not the work is progressing, but that it's in-point evaluation at this very moment about whether or not the document and the actions do make sense. Is the evidence coming together in a way that suggests for some actions to take place or not? For example, that needs to be always evaluated on the point. So it's important to understand it's fluent, dynamic, and it's a negotiated undertaking, and very different to the business world where you follow rather the execution of a project proposal. So now one of the things that one might want to do, besides looking into guidelines on how to build up a thesis proposal, is to look into examples of research proposals, and ideally commented examples that are made available from university repositories, and not necessarily student examples, because for once, research proposal examples from students are more difficult to find because they're early works. But for the other, you don't want to build on something where you can't evaluate the quality of the example. So if it's just something you pick up from the students, then it is very difficult for you to evaluate whether or not this is up to the standards and expectations. Hello, Anna. Hello. Who else do we have here? Out. Okay. So, and what do I mean with good versus bad examples to follow? I just picked up this piece of writing that we've been using for an earlier webinar on issue identification, problematizing, and research question framing, where we distinguished in between solution-focused research questions and problem-focused research questions. Now, you start from the very same context and from the very same problem statement and are on the very good pathway, but then you do a fundamental mistake. You ask the wrong question. How can we make things work, rather than what is the issue with things not working? Which in turn will put you on a very different research pathway. In the solution-focused scenario, it will put you towards gambling to a random solution, while in the problem-focused scenario, it will make you investigating in depth a problem and attempting to really understand it, and only then to understand how it could be resolved. So depending on the framing, things might work out very differently, and therefore, if we want to follow example thesis proposals, we might want to make sure we follow those ones that are commented by people that know about such differences. Or alternatively, we raise this awareness ourselves in between what are the critical elements to not follow and what are the critical elements that should be followed. Now, after this initial overview about what a CSIS proposal theoretically should cover and where to find support and guidance, let's now get a bit more into the practice on how to craft the proposal, what we need to cover, and what to take further into the first CSIS draft. Now, if we look at the points that we pointed out in the earlier slides, and under coverage, we would come to points like problem issue statement, research questions, key literature sources and related studies, methodology, data and findings, analysis and evaluation, or the conclusion. Now, those things are translated in the CSIS proposal and in the later CSIS drafts a bit differently. So let's look at the proposal, where we are focusing now on. The problem statement here should be shown as perceived. The research questions should be presented in a way of what is not clear or understood. The key literature sources should clearly bring out who was looking at this earlier and how have they been looking at it. Likewise, the methodology should draw on key literature sources that you already could identify from related studies. And on the data, you should try to identify from the key literature sources, but also from your work environment, what sort of data could or should be collected and from where, followed by how it can be analyzed and evaluated. And the least important at this point in time is the last, what are the expected outcomes of the research, which mainly will be important from one perspective that we will be looking at later. Okay, let's move into the next slide. Now, there are two entry points into the proposal or from proposal to CSIS. The first entry point is the literature. So one starts with key literature sources and related studies to try to build up the knowledge from that end. This works out very well, and it works out very well for a very long time. So one can easily be spent 2 or 3 years just reading, and one will build up ever more knowledge that is very interesting, but that is not leading to any further point. So it's a very viable point to start, but it's also a very dangerous point because one can get lost on this point for almost ever. Second entry point into the CSIS is over the data and findings. Now, one could argue for that one first needs to collect data and findings, but for our case, we are working on workplace-based problems, therefore are immersed to the problem on a day-to-day basis, which also means we do have a relative clear understanding about the problem as we perceive it. Like we have data available from any written communications that we came across, be it memos, email communication, strategy papers, and the like. So there's actually a starting base that we can use in conjunction with the literature to make our entryway into the proposal. Is this still making sense?
Yes.
All right. So what is important at this point to mention is that research is not a linear undertaking. Now, we write our research plan in a neat and nicely manner that has a starting and end point, and it looks like it's very linear. And as a matter of fact, your CSIS proposal will read very linear, like your CSIS will read very linear, because this is the way we are writing it up. But it's not the way it's taking place. It's not the way you form your knowledge, and it's not the way that you build up and construct your research. So that is rather a front and back juggling. I think it's important to understand that, because that helps to avoid trying to work in a linear way and say, now chapter 2 is done, next. It's not like that. So then, what do we need to cover in the different parts? In the problem and issue statement, we should try to be as specific about the issue as we understand it. So if we experience a high fluctuation rate, then we also should look at what is the issue with that. If the marketing material is not reaching customers, then we also should look in the issues behind that. So those are questions that are directly geared towards crafting and deriving afterwards actionable research questions and towards finding key literature sources. This is a very, as a matter of fact, linear and straightforward way. Insofar as you can derive directly the questions from the problem statements. So if we experience high fluctuation, then the obvious question to start the research of is why is there a high fluctuation rate? So this part of the research is very linear and straightforward and will bring us very quickly into relevant literature sources where we can follow up on that and understand why, in this case, for example, fluctuation is happening. Now, having said that, at this point, likely the linearity stops a bit because we will accumulate knowledge that will change the problem perception. At the point the problem perception changes, the problem issue statement is going to change, which means the research question is going to change, which means the key literature sources are going to change. So it's therefore important to well document those changes because each iteration and change is potentially a piece of your thesis and can be used in it. Perhaps not in the direct way, but in a derived form at a later point. So working accurately and taking notes and documenting what you're doing and keeping those changes well structured is helping to write up the thesis proposal initially and the draft thesis later. Now, what then again is linear, however, is to get to the methodology via the key literature sources that are identified, because related studies will come with some methods carried out, some questions that have been asked. So this is again where the linearity ends, because the questions that have been asked already will be contrasted with your initial questions that you post there, and that will fuel further into your analytics and thereby impacting the way you frame your questions. And again, it will relate to the data that could be collected and from where they could be collected. So key literature will point you to what can be collected and how it can be analyzed, while your work environment will tell you how you have been already collecting data and how you have been already evaluating things and with whom you have been engaged. So there's a mutual feedback or double feedback loop in between the two ends, the theoretic work and the problem as you understand it. Wait, there's some else. Now, earlier studies finally also will help you in your evaluation and the analysis of your findings. Now, I initially said that once it comes to the conclusion, it's at the starting point, perhaps not that important to speculate about expected outcomes. I mean, there are sure outcome expectations, which is that the issue will be resolved. This is a very practical outcome expectation, but this is also the outcome expectation that potentially can corrupt your research by biasing it and making you look rather at solutions than following to look at the problems beneath. So trying to take the outcome expectations out of the equation as much as possible is therefore advisable to keep the research flowing. So now, in the third part of the slideshow, we will look at what to take further into the first thesis draft, which we already discussed on theoretical grounds initially. Now, if we understand that data and findings is something that you do hold already at the beginning, then it certainly can help to rework the thesis after you have submitted the proposal and having received clearance from this end. Because at this point in time, you are officially entitled to engage with stakeholders, to collect data, and thereby do and conduct the research. So quick iterations in between doing research and collecting data, and then analyze the findings and check back what it tells with regard to your problem understanding, the research questions, the relevant literature, or how the methods have been working out, is a viable point after you start taking the research further. And at this point, one very well can start to map out or mirror out the entire thesis structure by gradually building up the specific points of the thesis. And again, the data and findings provide a suitable mean for doing so. They allow you, for example, to make sense of the literature, like what am I looking at and why. They allow to understand what has been used from related studies methodology-wise and in which context. And from there, they allow to further reframe the research questions or the issue statement. So it's a good entry point to keep your research focused and going, and it allows to assure the work is getting structured and for you to gradually mirror out the table of content on how the different informations add up. If you talk about something in the findings and analysis chapters in a very specific way, that will allow you to apply the same specific terminology once it comes to the literature review, thereby allowing you to establish boundaries on what to look at in the literature and what not. So this level of accuracy can help you going through your research and seeing it getting saturated, and see how initial research questions that we are looking at what is happening here, why is it not working, or why is A happening once I do B, to evolve into more saturated questions like what are the questions that this research has answered? How do the questions relate to each other? Or what are the overarching themes and patterns that could be derived from such questions and from the findings? So it's a slow progression from the initial proposal towards the final research and the final draft thesis that then will allow you to be more and more specific. Like in this case, for example, based upon the answer, you then clearly know that a viable question to this answer would have been, what 3 words best describes France? And the answer would be cheese, wine, and rubbish. Now, this is a slow and gradual development process that you will be seeing, and that then allows you to become more and more specific, working out the structure of your thesis and mapping out how things belong together. And I think what is very important here, it's to understand it's a dynamic process and it's a dynamic piece of work. It's constantly evolving. So it will change, it's normal, and it will require to go back over and over to the same documents. That requires some dedication, and it is something that needs to be done. So with this, we covered the 3 parts of this webinar on how to draft the thesis proposal and how to take it further ultimately into the thesis. With this, let me also stop the recording here to allow for some free flow of questions. Let me see how I stop the recording. Yes.